All right, everybody, welcome back. Today we're going to be taking a deep dive into something that could have a pretty big impact on a lot of people.
Hmm.
President Trump's executive order
Yeah.
that revokes Executive Order 11-1246.
Right.
And that's one all about affirmative action for federal contractors.
Yeah, and this is one of those things that, it sounds very bureaucratic,
Yeah,
but actually it's really going to have some pretty big potential impacts for a lot of people.
yeah, absolutely. And we've got some great sources to help us unpack all this.
Mm.
We've got articles from the National Law Review, Axios, and Pink News.
So we're coming at this from a few different angles.
Yeah, exactly. We've got a good variety of perspectives here, and this is a pretty complex issue. So we really want to make sure that we're breaking it down
Mm-hmm.
and that we really see how this might affect everyday folks like you listening right now.
Yeah, and what's so interesting about this is it's not just about people that work directly for the government.
Right.
It's talking about companies that do business with the government. And let's be honest, that's a huge GE chunk of the economy.
That is a whole lot of companies.
So this is much broader than maybe a lot of people would initially think.
Yeah, okay. So before we get into the nitty-gritty here,
Mm-hmm.
can you kind of remind us what Executive Order 1-446 actually was? I mean, it was signed back in 1965. So
Yeah.
what was the situation back then?
Yeah, so you got to rewind back to 1965. President Johnson signs this order, and the whole goal is to tackle discrimination, right?
Yeah.
Promote equal opportunity for women and people of color
Right.
when we're talking about jobs related to federal contracts.
So basically it's saying, hey, if you want to do business with the government, you got to, you got to make sure that you're giving everyone a fair shot.
Exactly.
Okay.
So this new order is aiming to undo that. It takes 11-1246 and basically tells federal agencies to stop prioritizing things like diversity, equity, and inclusion, so DEI,
Got it. DEI.
in hiring and contracting.
Okay. So, I mean, I'm already seeing a lot of questions pop up in our chat here. People are asking, what's the reasoning behind this? I mean, this executive order talks about this idea of eliminating illegal preferences.
Yeah.
What does that even mean?
So that's really the key phrase here, and the order uses this term illegal preferences to suggest that affirmative action leads to people getting hired based on race or gender and not their actual qualifications.
Okay.
The argument here is this is a system that hurts qualified candidates, and it creates this idea of quotas, forced quotas that employers have to meet.
Okay. So, I mean, the point of affirmative action, though, right, is
Yeah.
to kind of level the playing field, address historical inequalities.
Right.
How does getting rid of that promote merit-based hiring? I'm a little confused.
Yeah, and that's really where the crux of the debate lies. So Trump and his supporters argue this actually aligns with the Civil Rights Act of 1965.
Okay.
And they're saying focusing on race or gender in hiring goes against the idea of treating everyone equally regardless of their background.
So it's a very different interpretation.
Okay, so it sounds like there's like two very different sides to this story.
Yeah.
You've got people saying this is about fairness. This is about merit-based hiring.
Yeah.
But then you've got these critics that are saying this could actually set back progress for women and people of color in the workplace.
Exactly. And to add even another layer onto that,
Yeah.
some businesses, even before this executive order, were already kind of pulling back on their diversity, equity, and inclusion programs.
Really?
Yeah. There's been a lot of pressure.
Wow.
Pressure from conservative groups, lawsuits challenging these initiatives. This new order is very likely to embolden that trend even further.
That's really interesting. It kind of makes you wonder, I'm really curious about how this will actually impact people like on the ground level,
Yeah.
real people's lives and careers.
That's the real question here, right?
Yeah.
How does policy actually affect people?
Right.
And that's what we're going to try to unpack. Exactly. All right, so listeners, we've got a lot more to cover in this deep dive, so stick around, and we'll be back after a quick break.
So let's say, you're a woman and you're an engineer and you're applying for a job at like a big defense contractor.
Yeah.
Or maybe you just graduated from college, you're from an underrepresented background, and
Yeah.
you're really hoping to get that, awesome government internship.
Yeah.
Well, this order could make it much harder to actually prove discrimination if you feel like, you didn't get the job because of your gender or your race.
It's like the rules of the game have changed,
Right.
but nobody really told anybody that the rules were different.
Yeah, exactly. And it could get even more confusing
Oh, no.
because some states might actually push back against this
Right?
at the state level.
Wow.
So you could have a scenario where, California is like, nope, we're sticking with affirmative action.
Okay.
But Texas goes in a totally opposite direction.
Mm-hmm.
And so now you've got this patchwork of regulations across the country, and it's, oh my gosh, that sounds like a nightmare.
It's a mess for everybody involved.
Yeah.
Employers and job seekers.
So, okay, so if there's someone out there listening and they're thinking, well, I don't work for the government, this doesn't affect me, are they wrong?
Yeah, they might be wrong because, again, we're not just talking about government jobs.
No.
We're talking about any company that does business with the government.
Yeah.
And that's a ton of companies.
Yeah, that's a lot of companies.
Plus, there's also this ripple effect we have to consider.
Okay.
Because even if your company, let's say they don't have government contracts,
Mhm.
this order could actually shift the whole climate
Yeah.
around diversity and inclusion in the workplace.
So you're saying companies might just say, forget it, we're done with DEI.
It's possible, especially with this whole illegal preferences idea floating around.
Right.
Some companies might get scared
Yeah.
that they're going to get sued if they keep doing these programs,
Right.
even if they really believe in them. That's a bummer because it seems like we've made some good progress on the diversity front.
Yeah.
But this feels like kind of a step backwards.
It's definitely a shift, and it's really hard to tell what the long-term consequences are going to be. I mean, will we see less diversity in government jobs
Yeah.
among federal contractors? Will private businesses follow suit? How's this going to affect the careers of women and people of color?
I mean, those are huge questions.
Yeah, and we don't have the answers yet.
So I know
No.
we've been focusing a lot on like the downsides.
Mm-hmm.
Are there any arguments for this change?
Yeah, there are definitely people who support this, and they argue that it'll create a more level playing field
Okay.
by really emphasizing those qualifications over other factors.
Okay.
And they believe that ultimately it leads to a more merit-based system where the best candidate for the job gets the job, no matter their background.
Okay. So the idea is if you take race or gender out of the equation,
Yeah.
then you're making sure everyone has an equal shot based just on their skills and their experience.
Right. And they say that this is the fairest way to hire,
Mm-hmm.
and that it really lines up with, the principles of equal opportunity.
That are like enshrined in the Civil Rights Act.
Exactly.
But I mean, critics would probably say that you can't just ignore historical context
Right, yeah.
and all these systemic inequalities.
Yeah, they would argue that just focusing on qualifications ignores the very real challenges that people face
Mhm.
based on, their gender or their race.
Yeah, it's almost like there's this fundamental disagreement about whether we've even achieved a level playing field to begin with.
Yeah, that's a key point. This whole debate really hinges on how we view where we are right now.
Mm-hmm.
Do we think we've overcome historical discrimination
Yeah.
and that a true meritocracy is actually possible?
Right.
Or do we believe that systemic bias is still very much alive and well?
Yeah.
And that we need things like affirmative action to counterbalance those forces?
It's a tough question, and I think reasonable people could fall on either side of that.
Absolutely. And that's why this is such a controversial topic. It forces us to really think about these big questions of equality and opportunity and what a truly fair system even looks like.
We're going to need to think about that during the break because we have a lot more to discuss. Stick with us. We'll be right back. And we are back. As we wrap up this whole deep dive, I keep thinking about that Pink News article.
Yeah.
They were really focused on how this order might affect LGBTQ plus folks,
Yeah.
even within the broader category of people of color.
Yeah, that's a really, really important point. I mean, they face unique challenges, right?
Yeah.
And this order could make it even harder to address some of those issues. And I think one of the things that's tough here is the language in the order. It's so broad. Like, what does illegal preferences actually mean?
Yeah.
So it just leaves all this room for interpretation, uneven enforcement. So
Yeah, it's like opening up this Pandora's box almost.
Yeah.
Of
Yeah.
what qualifies,
Yeah, and that's why I think we have to look beyond just the surface, these arguments about merit, and really consider, like, what are people's lived experiences on the ground?
Yeah, because merit, that can be such a slippery concept.
Yeah.
I mean, who decides what's meritorious?
Right.
And how do you measure that objectively, especially when you consider things like unconscious bias
Absolutely.
that can sneak into those hiring decisions even when people have good intentions?
Yeah, you're totally right. I mean, a pure objective merit-based system, it sounds great in theory.
Like on paper. Yeah.
But in the real world, it's
Yeah.
just way more complex.
Right.
I mean, there's so many factors, And to think that we can just wipe away all those different kinds of bias by
Yeah.
just saying we only care about qualifications, I think that's a little naive.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, so if I'm listening to this
Yeah.
and I believe in diversity,
Mm-hmm.
I believe in merit-based hiring, how do I even approach this?
Yeah.
Because it feels like those two things are suddenly at odds.
Yeah, no, that's a really good question, and I don't think there's an easy answer. It requires us to really grapple with how complicated systemic inequality is,
Mm-hmm.
and to acknowledge that we can't just ignore race or gender or other aspects of people's identities
Yeah.
and expect that to create a level playing field.
Yeah. It feels like we're trying to solve a Rubik's Cube where all the sides are the same color.
Yeah.
Like, where do you even start?
Yeah, it's tough. I think the first step is to stay informed.
Good.
Keep paying attention
Yeah.
to how this is being implemented,
Mhm.
what kind of impact is it having on different communities,
Right.
what are the legal challenges that are going to come up.
So don't be afraid to ask those tough questions
Please ask tough
and
questions.
challenge those assumptions. Yeah.
Yes, challenge assumptions. I mean, I think, in a world where information can be manipulated so easily,
Yeah.
we need critical thinking now more than ever. So don't just take what you hear at face value.
Right.
Really dig deeper, look at different perspectives.
Yeah.
Form your own conclusions.
Stay curious.
Yes.
Stay curious. Keep those wheels turning.
Keep thinking.
Well, this has been such an insightful discussion. Thank you so much for helping us unpack this
Yeah, it's been great.
really complex issue.
I love a good deep dive.
Yeah, absolutely.
And, yeah, hopefully this has been helpful for our listeners.
Yeah, and to everyone listening out there, thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
Mm-hmm.
We'll catch you next time for another one.
Sounds good.